Hello, fellow adventurers, ready to embark on another fantastical quest with Gretchen. You're in for an epic tale. Welcome back to my channel, your gateway to magical stories. Today, we're delving into The Troll and the Minotauress, Episode 7, in the Gretchen's Misadventures series by P.A. Mason. In this thrilling tale, join us as we follow Gretchen on another misadventure, where unlikely dalliances and mythical encounters await. So grab your map, a sprinkle of courage, and let's unravel the enchantment of the Troll and the Minotauress. The Troll and the Minotauress. Chapter 1. Stop! Gretchen brought the business end of a broom down on the ogre's head. Shaking! She thumped him again. That gnome! The broom handle broke in her hands, and the ogre dropped the mischievous gnome who'd upended his drink moments earlier. Right! Gretchen screeched. Get out, the lot of you! A concert of groans erupted in the Salt and Bog's taproom, and Gretchen turned with a snarl. None of you try this rubbish when Jurgen's around. If you think I'm going to be a light touch, you're sadly mistaken. Leave now, and I'll consider opening up again tomorrow if you remember to bring your manners. Stools scraped on the battered timber floors, and a few of the regulars began chugging the last of their ale before standing. Gretchen tried not to listen too closely to the dark muttering among them, and helped the last gnome out with a heel to his backside before barring the door behind them. She turned and leaned heavily against the door with her eyes closed. It was only day 2, and she was already beginning to wonder why she'd agreed to hold the fort while Jurgen went off on his mysterious vacation. Sure, her new cellar was already mostly dug out, and Jurgen had brought over the lumber to line the walls, but she'd almost forgotten what a handful the regulars could be without the burly troll around to keep them in line. Her foul mood, she decided, had more to do with Nora's convenient absence on the night before it was her turn to take over. Her friend was never a morning person, and the chances of her arriving any time before noon were slim. Gretchen had a feeling she wasn't going to get to her stall in the city in the morning, and with the last orders of medicinals placed before she shut up shop, she would miss out on a good chunk of change if she didn't deliver. Vacation, she muttered. Who ever heard of a troll going on vacation? Stopping only long enough to bank the fire in the hearth and douse the lanterns, Gretchen left the mess behind and moved through the kitchen with her mind on getting a good night's sleep. The mattress in the guest room was so soft she thought it might consume her, and her back had ached after climbing out of bed that morning. She thought she might make a pallet for herself on the floor as she climbed the stairs. And if Nora didn't show up in the morning, she had a mind to lock up the tavern until Jurgen returned. Gretchen paused by the door of the troll's bedroom and arched an eyebrow at her scruffy purple feline curled up on a pillow. Mulligan's only response was to stretch his legs and yawn. Traitor, Gretchen admonished, though she knew her familiar had a particular affection for Jurgen. Further down the hall, Gretchen rubbed the small of her back and dragged the pillows from the bed. The room wasn't particularly large, and she almost knocked over the nightstand as she tried to heave the mattress off the sprung bed frame. The mattress gave way and slid to the floor like a gelatinous mess. Gretchen kicked it in irritation. As she pulled off her boots, she wondered for the umpteenth time where Jurgen had wandered off to, and pulled her pointed hat from her head. The venture undoubtedly had something to do with the letters she saw him clutching to his chest when he thought nobody was looking. She was almost certain there weren't any other enchanted trolls kicking around on account of having accidentally enchanted him herself, and couldn't begin to guess what kind of creature he was wooing. A dwarf, perhaps, or maybe even a yeti. She would have to give him some kudos if he'd sweet-talked a brownie, and perhaps if he brought her back to the Salt and Bog, she could negotiate a spring clean back at her place. The cobwebs were starting to look like the spider fortress in the fairy tooth realm, and she couldn't remember the last time she'd polished the... Hope I'm not interrupting. Gretchen swung around and stared at the man leaning against the doorframe, a wry smile tugging at his thin lips. Black hair standing at impossible angles jutted from his head, and Gretchen shook her noggin to clear the apparition from her clearly addled mind. When he didn't dissipate back into her imagination, her cheeks burned with outrage. I said out, how dare you sneak up and... Gretchen's mouth hung open as she looked the guy up and down. His clothes seemed foreign, and his pointed teeth made her question if he was a regular human or another creature entirely. "Who the heck are you?" "The Lord of the Labyrinth," he drawled. "You must be the troll's keeper." "The troll's what?" Gretchen spluttered. "I don't know what kind of joke Jurgen's playing, but you've picked the wrong night to come and rattle my cage, mister. If you don't—" The strange man leaned closer and sniffed. "Yes, I can smell the reek of his enchantment on you. Your troll has strayed onto my lands. If you ever want to see him again, I suggest you come and collect him." A cold grip of fear gnawed at Gretchen's belly. Nobody except her and Jurgen knew how the troll came to be enchanted. "What are you?" she demanded. "And what have you done to my friend?" His laughter was mocking, and he drew a scroll from under his belt and handed it to her. "You have 3 days to retrieve him. I'm afraid it will be too late after that." Gretchen blinked as the stranger evaporated into a cloud of smoke, and she turned to be sure he wasn't standing behind her. With magic like that, she would expect him to be a wizard of the highest order. She twitched her nose to be sure, but the distinct lack of allergic reaction told her he couldn't be of their ilk. Staring at the scroll, she moved woodenly to sit on a small stool in the corner and untied the ribbon sealing it. It didn't seem to be the enchanted sort, and when she unfolded it, she was glad it didn't explode in her face. For a moment, she wasn't sure what she was looking at, but as her eyes followed the lines, she recognized it as a map. Most of its mass was the sea which separated the 2 continents. A circle around a small island off the south continent's coastline drew her eye, and she squinted at as though the marking held answers to the questions swirling in her mind. The island wasn't even named, and Gretchen's first thought was how Jurgen could have gotten that far in the first place. A sea voyage would take days, and the closest port was beyond the city. "Lord of the Labyrinth," she recalled. What a stupid name. If it was some kind of gimmick, and she arrived to find Jurgen in a quirky bed and breakfast next to well-trimmed hedges, a seller wouldn't begin to compensate her for the trouble. But she knew deep down Jurgen would tell no one of his creation, as much to keep her from unwanted attention as his wish to live quietly as a publican. "Mulligan?" she croaked. Her familiar should sense her discomfort, she told herself, and come and offer a mangy shoulder to cry on. But he had never been that kind of cat. She moved from the guest room to find him more or less where she'd left him, and sank to Jurgen's bed to pluck him into her lap. He gave a disgruntled chirrup and glared up at her, but she smoothed her hands over his fur and began talking. "The southern continent, Mulligan! I should have made him tell me where he was going. It'd be just like him to go and talk trash to some magical creature and end up in trouble. Who were those letters from, anyway? I thought I was giving him space, you know. Figured he'd tell me who his lady friend is in good time, and—" Gretchen blinked and looked around Jurgen's neat room. Her eyes fell on his nightstand, and she turfed Mulligan from her lap to reef the drawer open, spilling the contents on the coverlet. Her feline familiar stalked off in a huff, and Gretchen spread out the mess of socks, handkerchiefs and coins, and plucked up an envelope with a victorious hiss. "Ah, ha," she announced. "What have we here?" She thumbed the back of the envelope and pulled out a letter addressed to her friend. As she scanned the contents, she threw it away in disgust. A polite note to let him know his poem titled "A Hairy Bard" had not been accepted in the Scribe of the Realm's snooty literary publication. For only the briefest of moments, she wondered when he'd taken up poetry. He would have figured she would snoop, and must have hidden his love letters somewhere he thought she wouldn't find them. Jurgen had underestimated her, Gretchen thought, and she flung open chests on the far wall to dump his clothes over his bed in a frenzy. As she searched his room, Gretchen worried over each of the words the stranger had said to her. 3 days to collect him? Or what? It would be too late for what? There wasn't even a feasible way to get there in 3 days. She may have a chance if she took to the skies right away and chanced a long journey over turbulent seas on her broom. But even then, she doubted she would do much more than circle from above looking for the right rock to land on. No, to get there, she would need something more powerful than a broom. Nothing short of a portal stone was going to do the trick, and she knew of only a few people who could get her access to one. Giving up on his bedroom, Gretchen tore down the stairs and began upending canisters of herbs, sacks of flour, and even checked behind each keg to look for a bundle of notes. Perhaps he'd taken them with him, she considered. If he had, this lady friend must be really something. Gretchen wandered into the bar and pulled down a bottle of apple brandy to calm her nerves. Thoughts of sleep had fled, and she held the bottle to her lips and drank deeply. From her angle, she saw the folded corner of a note jutting from the top shelf. She sputtered and slammed the bottle down on the bar. Her friend was misinformed if he thought she was above drinking his top-shelf liquor in his absence. After fetching a stool, she brought down a single letter and a better bottle of brandy. The light in the room was dull, so she pulled a light charm from her pouch and waved it in irritation as she spoke the incantation to awaken it. Clear, white light illuminated the missive, and she opened it on the counter to inspect it closely. "I cannot wait to be together, my love, and send this stone to usher you to my island home. You need only think of me, and it will activate. On the border, speak my name, and the path shall emerge. A. Kiss Kiss." Gretchen uncorked the brandy and poured herself a healthy dose. Jürgen had either been catfished in the worst kind of way, or the labyrinth guy had an accomplice. Chapter 2. Gretchen didn't bother looking over her shoulder as the kitchen door opened behind her, instead drinking the last of her coffee and thinking of any last-minute supplies she may need. "It looks like a bomb has gone off in here," Nora grumbled. "Why didn't you kick them out if they started brawling?" "I did." Gretchen spun on her heel. "And they didn't. No time to explain. Jürgen's being held prisoner, and I need to go to the city to see Cordelia. It's the closest portal stone I can get my mitts on, and I'm not taking no for an answer." Gretchen moved to step past Nora, and her friend held out an arm with a sharp look. "Don't even think about leaving without explaining yourself." Gretchen closed her eyes and groaned. She'd been about to leave regardless of whether Nora arrived, and was vaguely surprised Nora had made the journey in the darkness of pre-dawn. The only thing that had stopped her from doing the same was the need to keep her arrival at the academy from being noteworthy to those who may stick their noses in her business. "Some weirdo showed up last night and threatened me." Gretchen pulled the scroll from her pouch and pressed it into Nora's hand. "Gave me this, said I had 3 days to pick Jürgen up." Nora pushed her spectacles up the bridge of her nose and squinted. "But this is a map. Who was this person?" Gretchen pointed out the marker on the map and sighed. "No idea. Wasn't a wizard as far as I could tell. Evaporated into thin air when I started demanding answers. I tore up the entire tavern looking for those letters Jürgen's been staring at and found this." Gretchen waited impatiently as her friend scanned the note and they puzzled over the information together. "What has that beast gotten himself into?" Nora mused. "Better raid the pantry if we're to go on a trip. The academy? You thinking of purloining a portal stone?" Gretchen's chest tightened as she tried to figure out a way to fob Nora off. As much as the older witch was her best friend, she knew her inquisitive mind wouldn't rest if she knew what magic Gretchen had instilled in Jürgen. Even with the best of intentions, her secret wouldn't stay safe with her for long. "I'm doing this alone, Nora." Gretchen kept her face neutral. "It's your turn to mind the bar, and I need someone to keep Mulligan fed. Besides, if this goes horribly wrong, you'll need someone to save you both." Nora sighed. "It's a shame the Baron doesn't see the use in portal stones, or I would have one myself. But I may have something that could be useful. Enchanted it just last night as a way for us to coordinate this place." Gretchen gave her a questioning look, and Nora drew a small notebook from the satchel she wore at her hip. It was a wonder Nora wasn't giving her much by way of argument, but then she never was much of a morning person. "What is it?" Gretchen took it gingerly between her thumb and finger. "I have its twin." Nora patted her satchel. "Rather complicated, the charm. Had me up most of the night trying to get it to work properly. But what you inscribe on that one will appear in mine and vice versa. Once you figure out what's going on, note it down. If there's any way I can assist." "Let you know," Gretchen finished and nodded. "Thanks, Nora. You're a lifesaver." Her friend gave her a strange look as Gretchen moved to the backyard, no doubt wondering at her severity even under difficult circumstances. But being lured to a tiny island to rescue a lovesick troll was less amusing than it sounded. She chafed her hands together in the brisk morning air, then grabbed her broom from the rack by the door. From the days of disuse, the unruly vehicle almost launched out of her hands, and she grimaced and held tight as it towed her to the bare strip of dirt to launch. She thought it may have a mind to play tricks on her, but must have been yearning for the air as it carried her swiftly up into the clouds without a fuss. Gretchen leaned down to gain maximum velocity, and her broom obliged as it cannoned toward the city, its darkened silhouette distinguishable in the dusty pink of the emerging sunrise. Cordelia would be a problem, Gretchen thought, as she bent her mind to how she would pry an item as valuable as a portal stone from her sister. The only other people she knew that had access to them would be even less inclined to help. Elod's emporium, where she acquired her infinity pouch, would likely have one lying around, but Elod spoke in currency, and Gretchen had nowhere near enough money to cover the cost. Virag the dragon dwelled in the mountains beyond the city, and though she thought she may have been able to sweet-talk the old lizard, there was no guarantee he would be in his lair. She could spend most of the day flying just to get there, only to be disappointed. Cordelia would be her only chance, and it would take all her wit to turn the Vice-Chancellor of the Witches' Academy to her way of thinking without letting on about Jurgen's enchantment. The stable boys looked surprised to see her land in the mud behind the midden heap, and she gave a wave as she stowed her broom in her pouch and kept walking. She'd finally gotten on good terms with the little urchins. Keeping them in sweets and practical joke charms had made her morning commutes that much smoother. They looked vaguely disappointed when she didn't slow, but at least didn't start hurling the forkfuls of dung they wielded in her direction. With purpose, she strode the streets of the city, now awake and bustling with morning trade. Gretchen couldn't remember a time she'd been so eager to get to see her sister, much less the academy, and trotted up the steps to the front entrance of the looming building with scarcely a cynical thought of the establishment. She smiled at the young witch sitting at the desk in the reception area and asked to see her sister on a matter of grave importance. Usually her sister kept her waiting, if only because she could. When she saw her sister's figure round the corner of the stairs, she sagged with relief and began the climb up to her. "Cordelia, come on, turn it around. We need to get to your office." Her sister stopped on the landing and folded her arms with a stare that could have frozen a hot bowl of soup. Gretchen paused mid-step and tried to recollect what she'd done recently to earn that kind of reception. "I was wondering when you'd turn up." Cordelia's nostrils flared, and she turned on her heel to stalk up to her office. Gretchen's heart sank. Seemed like the sheriff had sent a letter of complaint, after all. After climbing the ridiculous number of steps to her sister's office, Gretchen closed the door behind them, then faced her sister with a mulish stare. Cordelia only scoffed and crossed the room to pluck a folded note from an inlaid box on her bookshelf. "Necromancy," her voice was shrill. "Raising the dead on Halloween, some silly story for the magistrate about a ghost. And you have the nerve to come see me." Gretchen closed her eyes and promised to slip that sheriff a potion that would make him sit uncomfortably for weeks. She didn't have time to deal with the fallout from that night. In a Mirkwood spellbook, no less. Her sister's face was a mask of rage, and Gretchen dropped to the seat beside her desk. "Any ideas on which of our ancestors might have put it there?" Gretchen scowled. "I've a mind to conjure them up next year to let them know how much trouble they caused." "You," Cordelia spat. "You caused the trouble, same as always. Just because it was in the book doesn't mean you had to—" "I know." Gretchen held her hand up. "Do what you must. But that's not why I'm here." "Looking for a favour, Cordelia cocked her head. "Need your sister to clean up the mess you've left behind you again?" It had been weeks since the incident with the zombie. Gretchen frowned as she wondered why she hadn't been summoned, or had her license revoked since then. "Jurgen," Gretchen spoke slowly. "You remember him, right? Saved us all from the mirror. He's trapped in some labyrinth and—" "I don't care!" Cordelia shook her head frantically. "I don't want to know. You get nothing from me, Gretchen. And as far as I'm concerned, I don't even have a sister." "Fine," Gretchen shrugged. "Then I'll have something to say on the subject of the fairy realm, caves, and giant spiders to anyone who'll listen." Cordelia's mouth hung open and her jaw worked. "What?" "You heard. When witches start hearing that the Academy knew about the portals the entire time and did nothing, How do you know about the portals? Lines creased Cordelia's brow. That's forbidden knowledge, not even a speck of it mentioned in the library. You were always certain Aunt Esme was gone, Gretchen sneered. Couldn't even bend your precious rules to put me out of my misery. Would you have even believed it then? Cordelia pressed her lips together. You would have concocted anything to live in hope. Would have gone through a portal yourself if you thought for a second she was on the other end. I did, Gretchen gritted her teeth, and she wasn't. Silence hung thick between the pair, and the fact the Academy hadn't reprimanded her officially fell into some order of logic in her mind. All those times her sister had renewed her magic license when she ought to have shredded it, and Gretchen had always believed it was from familial kindness. You have no intention of revoking my license, do you? She narrowed her eyes, and Cordelia's face blanched. Gretchen stood and took a step toward her sister, a nasty smile spreading on her lips. No, no, that would reflect poorly on you, wouldn't it? That's the only reason you've ever helped me before. Think of the family. Cordelia's voice sounded strangled. What would come of the Mirkwood name if it was known that such magic is recorded in our spellbooks? What family? Gretchen whispered. It's just you and me left. You're only looking out for yourself. Don't pretend you're being high and mighty. Her sister flinched as if struck, and Gretchen pointed to her chair. Sit down. You're going to get me a portal stone so I can save Jurgen from the labyrinth. After that, you'll never have cause to see me again. Cordelia moved to sit and shook her head before cradling her face in her hands. Impossible. Even if I were to bend to such blackmail, even I don't have access to the stones. What do you mean you can't access them? Don't you run this place already? Gretchen fumed. Cordelia held a fist to her mouth, and her eyes were moist in an unusual show of emotion. The use of portal stones must be approved by the council members, and even if I took a request to them, I would have to wait until they next meet. What do you mean by labyrinth? Perhaps if you would explain. Forget about it. Gretchen turned and marched out of her sister's office in a cold fury. She should have known it wouldn't be as simple as having Cordelia fetch a portal stone from the vault. It was never simple when it came to the Academy. She trotted down the endless staircases, sniffling at the rent in her relationship with her sister, and blinked away tears to get her mind back to what was a more pressing matter. She'd dawdled away precious hours for nothing. She crossed the tiled reception area and burst through the doors to the city street, with a mind to pay Elord a visit. He might barter for her infinity pouch, and as much as she loved the magical item, she was prepared to give it up if it meant she could get her friend back, and he would owe her one, a rather large one. The faces in the street passed by in a blur, most of them indignant as Gretchen stepped on toes and elbowed past in her haste. When she passed a darkened alleyway, she almost didn't see him. Having trouble? The strange lord of the labyrinth snickered. Perhaps if you ask nicely, I'll give you a lift. Gretchen looked away and turned back to him to be sure he wasn't a figment of her imagination. 3 days, she growled. 3 measly days to get to some stupid rock across the ocean with barely an explanation and no means of transport. Ah, he grinned. Well, I wanted to be sure the gravity of the situation sunk in. I stopped by that hovel of his. Some hag called Nora pointed me to the city. Gretchen's face fell, and she grabbed a handful of the man's ruffled shirt and pulled him closer. What did you do to her? Nothing, he leered and held his hands up. Not my type, I'm afraid. Gretchen unhanded him and refrained from retrieving her notebook to check for a message. It was the only edge she had in this contest, and she wasn't about to let the man know about it. She pulled her meanest face and planted a fist on her hip. Take me to him. The man gave a flourish of his hand and the city melted away. As you wish, he said mockingly. It was unlike a portal stone, or any other arcane form of travel Gretchen had ever encountered. 1 second, she was standing in the crowded streets of the city, and the next, a wall of twisted thorns stood before her, the howling wind coming off the ocean stirring its limp leaves. Chapter 3. Gretchen spun on her heel to be sure she was free of the nitwit of the maze and tried to take stock of the situation. She smelled salt on the wind, and behind her rocky outcrops jutted from the landscape severe against the sea of blue beyond. She couldn't fathom what kind of game the man was playing at, and after she was certain she was alone on the desolate scrap of land, she pulled her notebook from her pouch to inspect it for messages. Met the fellow. Seems rather odd. Can't make heads or tails of him. Helpful, Nora, Gretchen muttered, before jotting a quick note to let her friend know she'd arrived. She asked Nora to look into the labyrinth, then stuffed the book back in her pouch. Taking a few steps back from the wall of thorns, Gretchen craned her head to see what was beyond, but the tangle's height proved too great. She doubted even Jurgen's big head could see over the top. The land fell away sharply behind her, and she puffed out her cheeks as she considered the most efficient way to proceed. Bet that twerp has no idea about my pouch, Gretchen snickered as she reached to retrieve her broomstick. Piece of cake, zoom in, then zoom out, off to the southern continent, then jump on a ship home. Her broom thrummed in her hand, and she gave it a pat before manoeuvring it under her rump. Not a lot of options here. Slow and steady, huh? She pushed up off the ground with her feet, and the broom wobbled as it hovered just above ground. Gretchen leaned forward with a wince, hoping her vehicle was more forgiving than usual, and it inched forward and up at a snail's pace. She gritted her teeth and loosened her hold on the handle, trying to think gentle thoughts, when it shot ahead and up in an arc without warning. Gretchen screeched as it carried her out over the water, then steered into a wide circle around to the labyrinth. Its size was astounding, and the tangled mess grew so thick she couldn't see inside. In the distance, the maze gave way to rocks rising in the outline of a fortress. Gretchen squinted against the glare of the sun, and when the broom swooped down to the edge of the labyrinth, it slammed against an invisible barrier. She scraped past vicious thorns and fell to the ground with an undignified squawk. Gretchen lay flat on her back, taking ragged gasps as she made a damage assessment. Wiggling her toes, she moved each muscle in her leg and lifted her hands in front of her face. Scratches aplenty, she thought, but nothing broken as far as she could tell. As the shock faded and her body protested the battering, her temper flared at the situation. When I next see that schmuck, I'm going to douse him with the meanest itching powder in my stores. She sat up with a wince and glared at the thorns. With no other option, Gretchen pushed to her feet and rubbed her rump as she retrieved her broom, then walked along the wall to search for a way in. When the rocks became too treacherous to navigate, she reversed and tried the other way. Jurgen's note came to mind, and she double-checked the folded letter for a name to speak, but the only marking was the letter A. Rubbing a hand over her mouth, she tucked the letter away and grasped for the firestone in her pouch, with a satisfied cluck. "That'll learn him," she chuckled as she nestled the stone under a woody vine. Her gardening eye appraised the wall and she shook her head. "His own fault for not pruning regularly." She muttered the words to light her arcane fire, and blue flame shot up from the rock. Its magical properties should have ignited the tangle in seconds, but Gretchen frowned, as its lapping flames didn't mar the deadwood. She waited a few seconds, trying to reconcile what kind of magic she was dealing with, and growled before dousing the flame and dropping the hot rock back in her pouch. Curling her lip, she pulled out a pair of shears, but had a feeling they wouldn't work either. The shears at least severed the vine, but as she snipped, the ends melded again, not leaving even a trace of damage. Gretchen ground her teeth and howled at the sky, her fists bunched. "Let me in!" she bellowed. The wall in front of her split, and the sound of roots bursting and earth churning was somehow sickening. A musty smell wafted from within, causing Gretchen to wrinkle her nose, and she eyed the passage askance. Every fibre of her being warned her against going inside, but she studiously pushed her fear aside and stepped into the labyrinth. She didn't need to turn to know the wall had closed behind her. The snapping of branches and the movement of air confirmed it had locked her in. The surrounding air felt stale, like the magical energy had seeped away. Gretchen breathed deep, and a sense of panic welled in her mind. It was almost like the contraption the wizards of Sharon used to keep witches from magic, and Gretchen had only tolerated that for moments. Fighting to keep from shrieking, she wiped at the sweat beading on her brow. "It's okay, I'm fine. It's not like most of my magic works anyway. Just find the troll and ask to leave. He said I could take him. It's not like—" Gretchen bent to hold her knees and sucked in slow breaths to calm herself. She figured her itch powder would still work when she caught up to the trickster and closed her eyes to find a place of calm. After gaining some composure, Gretchen straightened and looked ahead to take her bearings. Taking Nora's notebook out, she drew a path straight ahead to keep track of her movements. "Every left," she muttered. "Maybe every right if that doesn't work." Puffing out her cheeks, she strode with determination down the narrow path and soon came to the first juncture. She turned left and journeyed into the labyrinth. Every path looked the same, the tangle occasionally snaring her skirt, and each time she turned, a flash of movement beyond caught her eye. Twisted shapes, not unlike the taunting Lord, haunted her along the way, though they were always out of sight before she could figure out what they were. "Lured here to get eaten, undoubtedly," Gretchen grumbled. She stopped to shake her fist in the air and called out, "This body is all gristle. Good luck getting a decent meal out of me." The vines shook beside her, its rustling reminiscent of laughter. Gretchen narrowed her eyes at the verge and stomped onward in a huff. Her legs ached, and her stomach's gurgling reminded her she hadn't eaten all day, and didn't have the good sense to pack a lunch, she chided herself. Just as she marked another junction in her notebook, a scribble emerged on the page. "What are you doing? If you're marking a path, I can assure you it's nonsensical." Gretchen realized Nora saw her drawings. She rolled her eyes and jotted down a reply. "This place is nonsensical. If you want to be helpful, find out how to get me out of here. I suspect magic won't work inside. Couldn't even torch the place with arcane fire." Rather than wait for a reply, Gretchen snapped the book shut and moved onward. Her neck hadn't stopped prickling since she arrived, and the feeling only worsened when she stayed still. She wouldn't find Jürgen sitting around, and she couldn't see why the labyrinth guy would bring her all this way to walk around an overgrown garden for the rest of her days. When she rounded the next corner, she heard the distinct sound of laughter coming from the twisted shape that scuttled from view. Quickening her step, she resolved to catch the wretched creature, but when she made the next turn, the space opened into a strange grove. Gretchen's eyes flickered between gnarled tree trunks, but she couldn't spot the creature who taunted her. The grove felt like progress, though, and she stepped between the trees, trailing her fingertips over the rough bark. The sound of ticking piqued her interest. In the centre of the grove she stood before a tall stone monument adorned with a crude clock face, but there were no hands to mark the passing of time. A brass pendulum swung underneath, which she supposed caused the noise. She screwed up her face and cast around for anything that might be insightful, then threw her hands up in disgust. "Yeah, I get it. I'm on a deadline. How the heck am I supposed to know when 3 days is up?" The only reply was incessant ticking, and she moved to the other side of the grove to seek another path. She noticed golden fruit hanging from a low branch and pulled one free with a frown. As she shined it on her shirt and lifted it to her mouth, a voice halted her. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The words were muffled, as though spoken around a mouthful of wool. Gretchen flung the golden orb over her shoulder and turned on the spot to find the source of the warning. She couldn't see anyone and took a few small steps toward the tree she'd plucked the fruit from. "Who's there?" "Got yourself in a right mess, haven't you?" A demented chuckle twisted the tree trunk, and Gretchen leaned closer to inspect it. A talking tree? Wasn't always a tree. Gretchen made out the rough lines of a mouth and eyes which looked like weathered knots. "Came here, same as you, didn't I?" Gretchen's eyes widened, and she stared around the grove for more signs of life. "You got turned into a tree?" The cackle was off-putting, and Gretchen wondered if she was talking to a fellow witch. "Nothing as simple as that, no. But once the magic in this place gets hold of you, well, you soon become part of the furniture, you see. Starts with the food. Tastes bloody magnificent. But after a while, everything gets bland. Food and water turn to ashes in your mouth. You get sleepy. Before you know it, you're as much a part of the labyrinth as those ruddy thorns." Gretchen blinked, and the grove seemed suddenly more ominous than before. "I'm just here to pick up a friend. Then I'll be out of here." "Oh, I know, dearie." The leaves of the tree shuddered with amusement. "Gotcha good, didn't he?" Gretchen bristled, but tried to keep her features friendly. "So, you going to help me or what?" "Help you?" The mouth twisted. "I'm afraid I've already said far too much. Be grateful that I steered you from your feast." But you know your way around the maze, Gretchen insisted. Tell me how I can find my friend. The tree whooped with laughter, and Gretchen folded her arms in front of her as she waited for the rustling to subside. She was about to turn and go when the tree gasped. Oh dear. Well, it's just so plain, really. Can't you feel it? The magic that binds you two together? Follow that, and you'll find your friend in short order. Gretchen flinched and backed away before spinning and fleeing the grove. She found a pathway just beyond, and took it, her feet swift underneath her. When she felt far enough from the mocking thing she'd conversed with, she halted and reached for a vine to lean against as she took stock of the situation. That her role in enchanting Jürgen seemed well known in this place was more than unsettling. It was a secret she hoped nobody would ever discover. She'd never even considered the possibility that Jürgen was bound to her, and with the muted magic inside the labyrinth. Gretchen held a hand to her mouth, wondering if her friend had partaken of the food in the maze, whether she would find a troll or some cruel echo of her former friend. Her heart pounded in her ears, and once again she fought for calm, for a void she could slip into and explore her magical self. Her warm affection for the scruffy rogue aside, the words of the tree rang true to her. Their relationship was closer in a peculiar way. Searching her mind, she stumbled on a pulsing energy, like that of a heartbeat, which she must have pushed into the recesses of her mind in a stubborn attempt to hide their secret. "Gotcha!" she whispered. When she tried to move her hand away from the wall, the vine wrapped around her wrist. Shrieking, she attempted to yank it free, but it held firm, cutting off her circulation. Chapter 4. "Get off me!" Gretchen snarled as she tried to break loose from the hedge. Mirthless laughter drew her attention, and she glared at the Lord of the Labyrinth, who grinned further along the way. "Having fun?" he asked. "You have some nerve, you treacherous little imp!" Gretchen gave up on untangling herself, luring me here under false pretenses to make me some kind of ornament. "Come now!" He clapped his hands together and struck a sombre pose. "Fair is fair, and I told you you'd have 3 days to free your friend." He reached into a silk pocket and drew out a pocket watch on a silver string. "I believe you have, 30 hours left." Gretchen tried to reckon the numbers in her head and looked upward to the dull sky. "How does that even work? It hasn't even gotten dark here yet." "Ah," he held up a finger. "Time is something of an abstract concept here. We keep the lights on, so to speak, to give our participants a fair chance of escape." "A fair chance?" Gretchen spluttered. "Without the means to measure time? I tell you what, buddy, when I get out of here, I'll bring the entire might of the witch community down around your ears." He only snickered and held the watch at arm's length toward her. The vine let go of her arm, and she stumbled toward the man with a mind to wring his neck. After closing the distance between them, he disappeared in a cloud of smoke, and the pocket watch dropped to the clipped turf. Seething, she stopped to pick it up and squinted at the face. It wasn't a clock at all. 72 hours were marked, and the single hand pointed just past the 30 stroke. Grumbling, she stuffed it in her pouch, and faintly hoped the enchanted item might keep the contraption from winding down any further. Nora was her best bet. She retrieved the notebook and flipped through the pages to see if her friend had come through with anything useful. Her tidy handwriting appeared past the hasty markings Gretchen had drawn, and she dropped on ground for a rest while she read. "From what I can gather, the labyrinth is old, exceptionally old, rumoured to be the lair of a mighty Minotaur who consumes unsuspecting passers-by who stray into its maze. I cannot find a link to that strange chap who came calling and have arrived at the Witches' Academy to establish a line of communication with the witch community on the southern continent. We have also sent an emissary to the Wizards' Guild to see if they can identify this man." "He isn't a wizard," Gretchen groaned. There was no way her nose wouldn't have picked up on it. Being allergic to their ilk only came in handy every so often. Gretchen groaned after rereading the passage. It sounded like Nora was rousing the entire magical world. The likelihood of getting out of the situation with her secret intact was diminishing by the second. She scrawled a quick note about the talking tree, dangerous fruits, and the pocket watch, with a postscript asking her to concentrate on an exit plan. If she could keep her friend busy nagging the Witches' Council for a portal stone, Perhaps it would keep them from delving too deep on why Gretchen was in the labyrinth to begin with. After yanking and sipping from a water skin in her pouch, she wiped her mouth with her sleeve and grimaced at the taste. It was like what she imagined Jürgen's boots tasted like, but at least it was fluid. She hauled her weary bones up, then concentrated on the magical energy in her mind. It came more freely than before, and taking a step forward, she felt as though she was heading toward the troll, rather than away from him. As she continued her circuitous route through the maze, the junctures became more frequent. At each turn she paused, and let her instincts carry her onward, the energetic pulse in her mind somehow in sync with it. At one such fork in the maze, she caught sight of the grove again, or perhaps it was another such place. Her intuition told her to move the other way, and she was grateful to avoid more unpleasant tree encounters. The magical link buried in the back of her mind buzzed like an annoying mosquito hovering. With its awakening, she hoped the sensation wouldn't be permanent and made a mental note to pry some answers from her spellbook once she got home. Home. She hoped escape wasn't wishful thinking. At least with Nora on the case, her demise would be avenged. With smiting, lots of smiting. Gretchen was about to stop for a rest, when fragrant notes wafted toward her, like a garden in full bloom. Curious, she pushed onward, and at the next turn stared open-mouthed at the utopian scene before her. A babbling brook cut through some of the best-appointed gardens she'd ever laid eyes on. The array of hues was magnificent, and each tree and shrub sculpted with subtlety and grace. Beyond the grounds, less sinister vines crept up the stonework of a picturesque cottage, with sprays of flowers decorating mullioned windows and carved woodwork. It was like stepping into a dream, only more confounding after the stark tangle she'd traversed for the better part of the day. The sound of water reminded her of her own thirst, but she reluctantly pulled out her water skin rather than chancing the stream. Her stomach gurgled appreciatively, and she gave it a pat before stepping onto a pristine gravel path leading to the house. If what Nora said was true about a minotaur, at least the creature wasn't slovenly. If she wasn't doomed to melt into the landscape, she had a mind to ask the fella how he went about keeping his azaleas flowering at that time of year. As her feet crunched toward the stream, Gretchen stopped in her tracks when a bird swooped past. Trying to focus, she glanced between the trees and the buzzing receded to allow her mind to register birdsong. Not gulls, as she would expect on a desolate island, but an array of exotic avian with magnificent plumage. She frowned at the sky above. It seemed brighter than the labyrinth, but the orangish glow from above seemed obscured, and what she took for clouds lacked definition. She reasoned the birds must have been able to leave the maze and was about to pull out her broom to test the theory when she heard giggles coming from the cottage. They sounded distinctly feminine, and Gretchen's eyebrows furrowed. Maybe not catfished after all, she wondered aloud. She couldn't sense any kind of glamour, and pushed dark thoughts of a sinister beast from her mind as she continued down the path to the cottage. The change in scenery seemed promising for Jürgen's condition, and Gretchen hoped it would be as simple as grabbing the troll by the ruff of the neck and hauling him out. Not that anything was ever that easy. More laughter sounded from around the back of the dwelling, and she crept past heady jasmine in full bloom to peek around the corner. Jürgen lounged with his head in the lap of a creature. Long feminine limbs and a shapely body were in stark contrast with a head that was distinctly bovine. Gretchen couldn't keep her lip from curling as Jürgen reached to rub his thumb over velvet soft tawny ears, which elicited another girlish giggle. She threaded a flower into his mane of hair, and Gretchen had to blink a couple of times to be sure she wasn't seeing things. A minotaur, indeed. Ahem! Gretchen held a fist to her mouth as she stepped into view and broke the spell between the two grotesque lovebirds. Hate to interrupt a moment and all, but I did get summoned to save your backside. Gretchen! Jürgen sat up lightning fast. What are you doing here? How'd you even find me? Gretchen cocked her head and nodded to his companion. Now come on, buddy. I know your manners left a little to be desired, but aren't you going to introduce me to your Aguilada? Jürgen's voice was gruff. Minotauress of the labyrinth and my soulmate. The soulmate in question smiled and squeezed Jürgen's shoulder as she stood. So hostile, Jurgi? Isn't this the witch friend you spoke of? Her voice was lyrical, like the bird song in the garden. Gretchen's mouth hung open as she tried to decide whether Aguilada was a friend or foe. She would be the strangest villain Gretchen has ever encountered. Wait, what? Jurgi? Gretchen was too miffed to laugh. Look, I don't know what you've gotten yourselves into here, but there's this little twerp getting around who gave me 3 days to get you out of here. And if the talking trees are anything to go by, leaving right now would be a good idea. Have you eaten anything? Of course you have. Trolls are voracious. But maybe there's still time, and if... Gretchen, Jurgen held up a hand. You're rambling. I think I know what's happened. Aguilada's face grew sombre, though she didn't seem surprised. Locathil. The name seemed to mean something to Jurgen, who turned to Aguilada with wide eyes. You said he was harmless. Mostly harmless, she corrected. Though he doesn't interfere in my affairs, this confirms my suspicions. He takes heed of which direction my missives take flight to. Gretchen followed the Minotauress's gaze toward a tree filled with exotic birds. She filed that morsel away in facts to be examined later, and planted her hands on her hips. That nitwit said Jurgen was in trouble. Gave me the right runaround too. Ended up bringing me here with a portal stone, which I think is no coincidence. She plucked the Aguilada's note from her pouch and waved it in the air. Portal stones grow on the talking trees around here, H.M.? The Minotauress's face darkened, but her features remained that of polite interest. Gretchen couldn't get a read on the creature, but her gut told her something was amiss. Crystal on the island is potent. Its kind is commonly used as the raw material for portal stones. Which didn't answer Gretchen's question, but before she could press the issue, Jurgen interrupted. What interest could Locathil have in bringing Gretchen here? I think we could all use a cup of tea. Aguilada gave Gretchen a thoughtful look. Please, come inside. She trailed off without waiting for a response, and Jurgen fell quickly into step behind her. The troll didn't look as though he had a glamour about him, but the expression in his eye when he looked at his lady love was like nothing Gretchen had seen on his gruff features before. Left with the choice to stay standing in the garden or follow, Gretchen held off on reporting her progress to Nora and went inside. The smell in the cosy kitchen had her belly gurgling as she set foot on the warm flagstones, and Jurgen settled into a wingback chair by the fire. If Gretchen didn't know any better, she would have thought the troll had lived in the place for years, and Aguilada hummed a tune as she readied a tea kettle. Pulling up a stout stool, Gretchen decided to question Jurgen first. So how the heck does a publican troll come to be trading love letters from a barren rock across the ocean? Gretchen didn't bother pitching her voice low. Jurgen smiled a little whimsically and folded his paws in his lap. Poetry. Gretchen blinked and recalled the letter of rejection she'd found in his nightstand. You two are in some kind of... I was, Jurgen shook his head. I'm a fan of Aguilada's work. She writes sonnets unlike anything I've ever read. All I wanted was to reach out, tell her how much her work inspired me, and from there... He shrugged. Gretchen puffed out her cheeks and shifted on her stool before clapping her hands. All right, fine. Well, I'm glad you had a nice little vacation here, but all good things must come to an end and all that. We'll round up what we can, and I'll figure out a way to get you both back to the Salt and Bog in one piece. Nora may very well come through with a portal stone, and... I'm not leaving. Gretchen blinked at the bite in Jurgen's tone. I meant to send a note. I was getting around to it. You'll have to find someone else to run the tavern. Aguilada and I are happy here. The Minotauress chose that moment to hand Gretchen a cup of tea, and the witch unintentionally knocked it through the air as she screeched and waved her hands. I have not come all this way, led by the very nose by some popinjay, to have you say thanks but no thanks, Buster. I was worried half to death that by the time I found you, you'd already be a garden ornament. It's not safe here, Jurgen. Perhaps not for you. Aguilada moved to stand between Gretchen and the troll. But I'll not let you take my Jurgi away. Chapter 5. What do you mean it's not safe? Jurgen stood and cast his gaze between the witch and the Minotauress going toe to toe. Gretchen opened her mouth to speak, but it was Aguilada who sighed and turned. I'm afraid she's right. The labyrinth has dark secrets, ones I have been too ashamed to speak of. She stooped to collect the broken teacup from the floor. My ancestors built this place on a bedrock of powerful crystal. When Lockathil arrived, he harnessed the unique properties of the maze to his own end, a fortress sprung from the ground, fueled by the energy of magical creatures. Gretchen decided there was something disingenuous in the woman's voice, but it was Jürgen who spoke first. Fueled, Agalada nodded, absorbed into the bedrock, channeled at his whim. Realization dawned on the troll's features, and he stared at Gretchen with his mouth agape. So, Gretchen is in danger, yes, though from what she's said so far, it sounds as though she hasn't partaken of the food here yet. Agalada's eyes glistened, and though Jürgen glanced at the pool of tea at their feet, his eyes softened as he encircled her in his arms. And I'm starving. Gretchen rolled her tongue across her teeth in distaste. But it's not just me in danger. Jürgen's brows furrowed, and Agalada stepped away from his embrace, wiping a stray tear from her eye. Gretchen considered the pair, and despite not trusting Agalada, she could sense genuine affection between them. "Oh, come off it," Jürgen huffed. "I'm not magical. You know as well as I do that most magic doesn't even work on me." It was Agalada who Gretchen watched as Jürgen spoke, but the Minotauress gave nothing away. Gretchen's shoulders sagged as she sought words to soften the blow, but she already knew her news would be unwelcome. Except for the fact that you are. Magical, that is. "What?" Jürgen scowled. "The only time magic did something," he choked, and Gretchen winced at the sound. "We're bound, as it turns out. A fact almost everyone in this forsaken place seems to know. Except her." Gretchen arched a tart eyebrow at Agalada. "Well, what do you mean, bound?" The broken shards of ceramic dropped from Agalada's hand, and she clasped Jürgen's hand. "What did she do to you?" Jürgen swallowed and stared into the cracking fire. And as the seconds dragged on, Gretchen thought he may have disenchanted himself out of sheer willpower. He managed. "Before Gretchen and I met, I was nothing more than a beast, an animal living under a bridge. She struck me, and all I remember was a sense of burning. After that, I became who I am now." Gretchen rubbed the bridge of her nose, remembering the day in question. Her poor underpants required a long soak after the troll had rushed her, and she had no way of knowing at the time that the potions she'd flung in desperation would have such a profound effect. It was an experience she'd sought to bury in the back of her mind, a decision which had come back to bite her rear end if the newly discovered magical binding was anything to go by. It was self-defense! Gretchen swallowed. The point is, this Lockathil guy knows all about it somehow. And a troll's intestinal fortitude notwithstanding, we should get out of here before we get fossilized, or trialized, or whatever. Agalada's face crumpled, and she turned on her heel to flee the cottage. Jürgen heaved a deep breath, and seemed at war as to whether he should follow. Gretchen puffed out her cheeks, and thought she'd better get some wise words in before he ran off. "Look, it's a nice garden and all, but you two will do fine together back home. If anyone knows their way around here, it's her. Supposing we avoid this little troublemaker, we should be out of here well, I can't even measure time here." The troll shook his head morosely. "You don't understand. She's never set foot outside the labyrinth. The idea would terrify her." Gretchen bit back a curse and smiled through her teeth. "Well, off you go, Romeo. Time to convince Cowgirl you are the damsel in distress, before it's too late." Jürgen waved a dismissive hand as he strode through the back door, leaving Gretchen to slump into the wingback chair beside the fire. She didn't know what to make of Jürgen's new girlfriend, but tried to push her reservations aside as a paranoid side effect of her journey. If the Lord of the Labyrinth really was in league with the Mino-whatever, surely the trap would have been sprung by now. With a mind to let Nora know what was happening, she reached into her pouch and frowned as she clasped a large jar. She knew her inventory by touch and couldn't remember. "The eggs!" Gretchen gasped. She opened the mouth of the pouch as wide as she could and eased out the jar. When one of her fellow stall-holders in the marketplace had gifted her the pickled eggs, she'd stashed it away with a polite smile. She'd never had a fancy for them and had intended to re-gift them at the first opportunity. But her stomach was in no mood to gripe about flavour, so she twisted off the lid with a triumphant grin. Not bothering to look for any utensils, she fished them out one by one and crammed them in her mouth. It was after finishing her hasty meal that she grimaced at the briny taste on her tongue. Liquid. She wasn't even sure if the water in the stream was safe to drink. And with her water skin almost empty, Gretchen considered which potions she had on hand that would do the least amount of harm. Too much of the cure-all potion, and she would put herself into a coma. The serums were more oil than water. A sleeping draught was out of the question, and most of the other potions she kept on hand would give her a bad case of eggy runs if taken in large doses. Except she could see no reason why her tonic for stomach ulcers would have a detrimental effect, and the licorice flavour after those eggs would cleanse the palate just nicely. She had 3 bottles stashed away, so she drew the first one out and sighed as she took a healthy swig. Her eyes were weary, and she stifled a yawn as she pried the notebook from her pouch and jotted down the gist of the story for Nora. Knowing that she had at least found her friend, and that his supposed soulmate could help them escape, Gretchen leaned back and gave in to the dark pull of sleep. If this is how it starts? Gretchen blinked her eyes open and focused on Jürgen holding his sleeve over his nose. Because if this is what it smells like, I'll leave right now. Gretchen wrinkled her nose at the stench of digested eggs and held a hand to her belly. When she opened her mouth to defend her bodily functions, a similarly rancid smell erupted from her mouth in an enormous belch. Jürgen took a step back and Gretchen cursed the ulcer tonic. She should have figured its properties would cause extra gas. Holding a hand over her mouth, she muttered, "I found some pickled eggs in my pouch. They've never agreed with me." Jürgen grimaced and moved the stool further from the fire to sit. "Well, if stinking us out was your objective, then you've made your point. Aguilada has agreed to leave." "Well, that's what I'm—" Gretchen held a hand to her mouth and burped. "Talking about." "I'm going to get a couple of hours' sleep. Locatil's fortress lies between us and escape, and Aguilada thinks he won't give over easily. If it comes to a brawl, we'll need to be ready. I don't suppose you have anything practical that may help." Gretchen considered the question and the odd dampening qualities the labyrinth had on her magical energy. "I honestly couldn't say. I have little cause to keep defensive charms on hand and learned the hard way that I should leave explosives to wizards. The maze has put a clamp on my powers. I doubt I could zap a mosquito at this point." Jürgen winced, but nodded. "Leave it to me then. If it comes to it, though, just make sure Aguilada gets out in one piece, okay?" Gretchen whistled and waggled her eyebrows. "So it really is love, then? I'm sorry the happily ever after thing didn't work out like you planned." "Nothing's ever that easy." Jürgen puffed out his cheeks and stood. "But I'm glad you came to warn me." Gretchen nodded as he trudged through the kitchen to what must have been living quarters beyond. The smell from her rear end had yet to dissipate, so she decided to get some fresh air. The garden was still bright and vividly beautiful, but the birdsong was absent, and Gretchen wondered if Aguilada's avian menagerie were timekeepers of the miniature utopia. After moving away from the stone cottage, she plucked out her broom to test her earlier theory. If Aguilada was getting messages out of the labyrinth by airmail, perhaps the ceiling worked differently in her domain. Getting out without the need to storm Locatil's fortress and risking Jürgen getting holes poked in him would be Gretchen's preferred option. She was glad to feel a thrum of energy from her vehicle as she gripped it and evacuated her gassy bowels before running down the clipped lawn with her broom to the side. The momentum woke the broom to its usual frisky self, and her leap into the air carried her upward just in time to get her backside onto the stick. Her stomach didn't appreciate the turmoil, though, and she cringed as she passed more gas. Hoping for the love of all things clean, it didn't result in a catastrophic underwear failure. Gretchen's digestive worries distracted her from the trajectory of the broom, and as she hit the orangish glow, her vehicle rebounded sharply, then pivoted toward a tree. Knocked from her perch, Gretchen clung to the bristles for all she was worth, and screwed up her face as she neared the closest branches. When the broomstick became locked between 2 limbs, she thanked her lucky stars that the collision wasn't worse. Her feet dangled clear of obstructions, but the drop to the ground was another matter entirely. She cast around for an accommodating bough to swing to, but the glint of light that caught her attention came from the direction of the cottage. Aguilada held a knife aloft and crept around the stone dwelling, casting her eye around. With Jürgen having gone to his rest, Gretchen scowled at the woman stalking her prey. Then her broom jolted down the branches. Staying in the tree would seem prudent, she decided, so reaching with her boot, she hooked her heel over the nearest branch. She pulled herself closer, which caused her broomstick to slip free, and held on as she swung upside down from one leg. With a grunt, she heaved herself up to get a handhold, and made herself a stern promise to get in better shape before going on any more adventures. It was only the notion of being filleted by a sentient cow that had her scrambling up over the branch, where she sucked in deep breaths and held a hand to her churning stomach. But the noise of her mishap had evidently reached Aguilada's ears, and Gretchen reckoned her chances of getting back on her broom as the Minotauress stomped toward the tree. "You'll not escape, witch!" she snarled. Gretchen belched a reply and backed up toward the trunk where she felt firmer footing. "I knew it! You and Locathil are working together. A poor troll just wants to be loved, and here you are sucking the life force right out of him. I'll tell you what I told the Lord of the Maze. After I'm gone, you'll have Nora Brightstar to contend with, along with the entire witch community. They'll raise this place to the very..." Gretchen clicked her teeth shut as the tree shuddered, and she risked a glance down where Aguilada stood at its base holding her head. As far as interrupting a good rant, Gretchen had to admit headbutting had impact, and when she opened her mouth to continue, her foe bellowed. "You dare insinuate that I harbour ill will for my beloved Jürgi?" Gretchen glared down at her bovine face. "If the shoe fits—" "It's you!" she raged, before thumping the trunk with her fist. "Your filthy magic has corrupted him. I'll cut the ties that bind you. Rid him of your taint." "Oh, right. Now it comes out. You're a magicist. That's why you don't seem to give a hoot about your precious maze being a trumped-up spider web for magical creatures. You think gutting me solves your problems? Even if it disrupts the enchantment, what do you think will happen to him?" Aguilada blinked up at her, the blind rage melting to fear. "That troll was tearing up goats with his bare hands when I met him. That's what you'll be to him. Meat." The Minotauress stepped back from the tree, shaking her head, her eyes already flooding with tears. Chapter 6. Gretchen changed her mind about the Minotauress's motives as she watched her slump wretchedly to the ground. Love did strange things to people. Not usually homicidal things, but Gretchen could at least understand the logic behind her attack. "I'm going to come down now," she called, hoping the tears weren't some kind of elaborate ruse. "How about you put away any pointy things you may have on your person?" Aguilada moaned pathetically, and Gretchen set about picking her way down the tree. The last drop to the ground sent a wave of pain up her spine, and she rubbed her back absently as she hobbled over to the distraught woman. Stopping short of arm's reach, she settled onto an accommodating rock and tried to put some rational thought into the situation. "Jürgen said you've never left the island before." Aguilada nodded, and Gretchen clucked. "Well, I can assure you, life in Edgewater isn't all that bad. Your boyfriend has a steady job, his own lodgings, and—" "I'm not sure I can," she snuffled. "Leave, that is." "Oh," Gretchen rubbed her chin as the statement settled into her brain. Nora had mentioned the Minotaur in the labyrinth citations in history dating back generations, and she could only assume Aguilada was some kind of great-great-granddaughter of sorts. "I'm, sorry to hear that. Maybe if we knew a little more, I have a friend on the outside who could help." Aguilada wiped her eyes and snorted. "Unlikely. The labyrinth must have a custodian. It was built that way. So leave it to the nitwit," Gretchen shrugged. "Or better yet, we flatten the entire darn island. You must know killing magical folk isn't right." "I had no way to stop him," she shrugged. "Dark elves are masters of glamour and illusion. When I first went to his citadel to demand he leave, he had me wandering the halls like some twisted version of my own ancestral maze." Dark elf, Gretchen mused. It explained why the twerp hadn't set off an allergic reaction on her part. She would need to stow that tidbit of information away for another time. If elven magic detected Jürgen's enchantment, she may need to ask careful questions of the wood elves that frequented the Salton Bog. "But you told Jürgen you could get us out." Gretchen arched an eyebrow. Or were you just saying that to get him out of the way while you disposed of me? Getting the two of you out is as simple as parting the vines. She chewed her lip. But it won't work for me. The only chance I have of crossing the threshold lies in the bedrock of Locathil's fortress. Gretchen rubbed her hands together, chiding herself from the uncharitable thought of ditching Agelada to gain freedom. So we make it happen. Magic may not be an option here, but that doesn't mean I can't administer a swift kick to the pants. Besides, she pulled out the stopwatch from her pouch. I have something of his, and maybe we can turn it to our advantage. Gretchen frowned at the clock face, which steadily counted down her allotted time. The pouch appeared to have no bearing on the enchantment, and she wondered if she would spontaneously combust when the hand reached 0. If there were any way to bend an enchantment, Nora would know. Excuse me. Gretchen cleared her throat. I've got to confer on the matter, so long as you're decided on leaving that knife on the ground. Agelada only nodded, and Gretchen left the troubled Minotauress to stride further into the manicured garden. She found an accommodating bench by the stream and bent her mind to the problem at hand and what the best use of Nora's time could be. She had a name and a species for the Lord of the Labyrinth, and if she could learn how to throw his glamour back into that smug little face, they may very well stand a chance of leaving unscathed. Nora's message back to Gretchen in the notebook was mostly griping. She was waiting for the council to sit so she could plead her case for a portal stone and had entreated Cordelia to summon them. Fat chance of that, Gretchen mused. She made a quick sketch of the timepiece before tucking it away and noted what she knew of Agelada and Locathil. So what I could really use is some pointers on how to take down a dark elf with nothing of note on hand. I'll take another inventory of my pouch, but aside from brews to vanquish boils and warts, I doubt there'll be anything useful. I'm counting on you. If she'd forgotten about the pickled eggs, Gretchen reasoned there may be other useful items lurking in the depths of her infinite stores, and after this adventure, she knew she had to put aside some serious time to stock her inventory with charms for unexpected eventualities. Itch power could never be the answer to all her woes, so she upended her pouch over the lawn and spread out a rather large pile of bottles, vials, stones, and scrolls. She started by discarding all the things she knew would be useless. Most of the medicinals, the arcane fire charms which had no effect on the hedges, and issues of the Witch's Digest she'd never gotten around to reading. She couldn't even remember where the charms to breathe underwater had come from, but she spared a thought on the irony of how utterly useless those were given. She was stuck on an island. The other items warranted further investigation, so she spread them in a circle around her and settled in to inspect them one by one. Gretchen was lost in thought and trying to recall how one went about activating a fog charm when Jürgen broke her from her reverie. He stood with a battered helm crammed on his head and a sword at his hip. Gretchen snorted with laughter. Yeah, very funny. Get it all out of your system, it's almost time to leave. He adjusted his belt and grimaced. Of course, Gretchen sputtered and waved. My troll in shining armour, where do you even get those? Throughout history, warriors from the southern continent came to prove their worth by slaying the Minotaur of the Labyrinth. He had the decency to look sheepish. And got their heads caved in instead, H.M.? Gretchen huffed. This place is disturbing. I don't know how you can stand it. You kidding? A sheltered corner of the world where nobody laughs at the troll who can talk, with a beautiful woman who loves me. It's pretty close to heaven, if you ask me. His eyes were earnest, and Gretchen nodded slowly. Well, nobody laughs at the Salton Bog, and if your girlfriend is half as handy in the garden as I think she is, it won't be long before you two lovebirds have your own paradise back home. Gretchen sighed. I don't think I'm going to be any help with Locathil. What is it with pouches? The bigger they are, the more crap you haul around, and never anything you actually need. Jürgen shrugged. Women. Yeah. Help me get this stuff back in here, would you? Nora may have some ideas on what I can whip together. Nora? Jürgen blinked. Gretchen handed the notebook to the baffled troll and explained the enchantment while putting everything back in her pouch. Gee, he let out a low whistle. Lucky she did, huh? Feel better now you know Nora's on the team, huh? Gretchen chortled. Nice to see you have so much faith in me. The troll gave her a long-suffering look and handed her the last of the cure-all. Gretchen, I don't know how, but you always seem to land on your feet. Barely, but you should at least be missing a limb by now. Thanks. She rolled her eyes and stood with a wince as her joints popped. We going to get this show on the road, or what? Just waiting on Aguilada, Jürgen sighed. I wanted to give her some time, to say goodbye to the place, you know? Gretchen held a hand to her gurgling stomach and passed a steady stream of gas. Well, we might want to wait over there if you know what I'm saying. Jürgen curled his lip and clattered toward the house in his plate armour. Gretchen bit back a jibe about their chances of getting to the fortress unheard with the racket. Worry gnawed at her over the notion of her friend being the only genuine force among their party. He had the upper hand in a room full of brawlers, but up against magic, she wasn't sure he would leave the island in one piece. Perhaps she should insist Aguilada bring her knife along. They found the Minotauress sitting among her birds, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. Her winged companions crowded close, and she reached to stroke each one. It was a final goodbye, and in its own way, quite touching. When Aguilada spotted the pair, she sniffled and stood, then lifted her arms as her flock burst up into the air. Bright plumage surged toward the orangish ceiling, and Gretchen's mouth gaped as she watched them burst through. There 1 second, gone the next. The evident communication between bird and bovine raised interesting questions on the subject of magical abilities, but Gretchen decided it was neither the time nor the place. Aguilada brushed off her skirt and collected a pack of supplies by the door. An impressive-looking mace sat neatly underneath, and she hefted it with surprising ease, then rested the shaft against her shoulder. Have you given her a sword? Aguilada frowned at Gretchen. Gretchen? Jürgen barked a laugh. Likely poke her own eye out. Gretchen couldn't argue with the statement, so instead patted her gurgling stomach and belched. Let's hope the stench knocks Locathil out cold. Jürgen shook his head ruefully. Are we ready? Aguilada took one last look at her cottage before nodding and trudging off down the gravel path. Jürgen fell into step behind her, and Gretchen thought it was probably for the best that she stayed downwind of the couple. They moved in the opposite direction from where Gretchen had entered the glade, and as the Minotauress approached a wall of hedges, the verge edged sideways to reveal a path beyond. It looked as stark and unwelcoming as Gretchen remembered it, and the witch hoped getting to the citadel would be less circuitous with a guide. But after stomping down nondescript pathways with intermittent turns for what seemed like hours, Gretchen stopped to wriggle her toes in her boots and groaned. Why is this taking so long? At this rate, the stupid watch will explode in my face before we even catch sight of this fortress. The watch is meaningless, Aguilada called out over her shoulder. Simply a way to keep track of you. Lazy, if you ask me. He may as well have given you a bag of breadcrumbs to scatter behind you. Gretchen scowled and fished out the watch to dangle in front of her face. A tracking device, eh? Well, listen up, Locatwit. I'm going to find you, and once I do, it's game over, pal. By the time I'm done with you, you're going to wish... Gretchen, Jürgen hissed, and pointed to the path further on. Stop talking to the watch. Puzzled, Gretchen sidled around the troll and blinked at the spike pit that barred their path. She was certain it hadn't been there a second ago, and beyond it, a dark citadel sprang from the rocky ground. Well, that's unfortunate. Gretchen turned a sheepish look to the Minotauress. Are there any servants' entrances you know of? Chapter 7. Aguilada only harumphed at Gretchen's attempt to make light of the situation and stepped to the edge of the pit. The stakes in the ground looked plenty sharp, and Gretchen saw shapes wriggling in the bottom. With a deep breath, Aguilada closed her eyes and held her foot out over the precipice. Aguilada, no! Jürgen went to grab the Minotauress, but she had already begun walking over an invisible floor. Gretchen and Jürgen shared an open-mouthed look, then watched as Aguilada made it to the other side unimpeded. It's glamour, she called from the other side. None of it is real. Jürgen took a tentative step, then hurried to the other side. Despite having witnessed the spectacle twice, Gretchen was still leery of attempting the same feat. What are you waiting for? Jürgen called. Gretchen's mouth watered like she was about to heave, but she turned back down the path and walked 10 paces. Screwing her eyes shut, she spun on her heel with an unintelligible cry and ran with as much conviction as she could summon. It was only when she barreled into a metallic wall that she landed with a thump on her backside and blinked up at Jurgen, grinning down at her. "Like a brick wall, isn't it?" he chuckled. Gretchen stood with a groan and rubbed her tender rump. The fortress loomed ahead of the trio, and Gretchen turned to cast a suspicious glare at the hedge behind them. Simple as that, huh? The spike pit had disappeared entirely, and the only way forward was a steep set of stairs leading to a pair of heavy doors. Piece of cake! Locathil is a conjurer of nightmares. Agalada stretched her shoulders. Inside, his illusions are far more elaborate. If all we have to do is ignore them, then I don't see how they pose much of a problem. Gretchen edged past the couple and took the stairs 2 at a time, feeling both renewed at the last stretch of the journey being within reach and relieved that she may get to a commode in the foreseeable future. "You'll see," Agalada called out, her voice sounding more smug than amused. "Are you trying to get yourself killed?" Jurgen clattered up behind Gretchen and held her shoulder as he sidled past. "How about you let the guy with the sword go first?" In stories about brave heroes storming the castle and onward to victory, Gretchen found it odd they never mentioned an acute need for a toilet and the newspaper or snippy remarks traded between the fellows. They must have cut those elements from the ballads, she reasoned. But Jurgen's whole attitude on going home was really starting to ruffle her feathers, and the lack of appreciation for having come to collect him in the first place was wearing thin. "Yup, you give those illusions a good cutting. Stick 'em until they squeal. I don't know why you even brought that stupid sword if all this guy does is make tricks of the light. The doors to the fortress burst open, and the clattering of hooves was the only warning before a mounted squad of guards came barreling down the stairs. Echoes of horseshoes on stone, a gust of wind bringing the smell of oiled leather and the sweating beasts that wore it. Guards calling out in wordless exclamations as they charged. It was all so real, and despite her dismissiveness, Gretchen leapt out of the way and almost over the side of the steps as the troop crashed past. After righting herself and holding a hand to her chest to slow her hammering heart, Gretchen scowled at Jurgen, who stood firm right where she'd left him, with the look that said, "I told you so." "Fine." Gretchen brushed off her skirt and raised her voice toward the fortress. "Made your point, trickster!" Agalada drifted past with a bemused expression, and Jurgen snickered as he turned to cover her approach. At the back of the line again, Gretchen sagged and followed. Inside the fortress the ceiling seemed impossibly high, and the entrance opened into a grand circular hall. Everything was symmetrical, from the dark columns to the urns spaced against the wall. The quality of the light was off, and Gretchen cast around for the source. While torches burned in sconces on the wall, they didn't appear to give off light, yet there wasn't a single shadow in the room. If defeat by baffling interior design was Locathil's endgame, Gretchen thought the elf had it covered. "Was it like this last time you were here?" Gretchen put her hands on her hips and spun on her heel, looking for a door. "No." Agalada's voice was soft, but it resonated in the room. "His intention was to mock me then. Now he wants to keep us from moving forward." Gretchen strode across the smooth, crystalline floor to the nearest wall and held her hand to its cool surface. She'd expected her hand to pass right through, and she frowned at the seemingly solid barrier. Hiding doors had to rate as a pretty ingenious solution to keeping out intruders in Gretchen's estimation, and she opened her mouth to say just that when a burp erupted from her mouth. The wall distorted, and Gretchen blinked as it bent back into shape. "Well, I'll be." Gretchen rubbed her chin and wondered what gastrointestinal properties had to do with a dark elf's glamour. "What is it?" Jurgen's voice echoed as he crossed the floor from the other side. "It warped." Gretchen chewed her lip. "Hold on. I want to see if Nora's found anything useful." Jurgen probed the unforgiving wall with the tip of his sword while Gretchen retrieved her notebook and thumbed through the pages. Nora's notes were brief, but she had jotted down one line of interest. Dark elves are susceptible to brimstone. Taken in large doses, the compound can be lethal to their kind. Brimstone. Gretchen blinked a couple of times and let the word bounce around her mind. It wasn't a compound she used regularly, and could only think of one source of the substance she had on her person: sulphurous eggs. She rubbed her belly and cursed herself for having eaten their best shot of ridding the island of the dark elf. "Sulphur," Gretchen whispered. "You wouldn't happen to have any, would you?" "Sulphur," Jurgen echoed, his voice carrying across the room. "Now why would I have any of that?" Gretchen clenched her teeth and was about to tell the troll to keep it down when the room darkened and a shrieking cry came from above. Gretchen crouched and lifted her gaze to see a serpentine figure swooping toward them. She tried to tell herself it was just an illusion, but couldn't convince her feet to stay put as she scrambled away behind an urn. Jurgen didn't even bother holding up his sword, but when the creature reached the floor and pivoted to circle round, its tail collected him in the middle and threw him across the room. A ceramic urn shattered, and Aguilada let out a cry. "I thought you said it wasn't real!" Gretchen crawled away from her hiding place as the floor shook and made a beeline for Jurgen. Aguilada bellowed in reply, and the dragon morphed into a more bird-like creature with massive talons. Taking cover behind a pillar as it passed her, Gretchen's irritable bowels erupted with gas, and the entire room flickered. For a second, Gretchen saw a large crystal obelisk on the far wall, then it was gone. Aguilada must have seen it too, because she lurched across the floor, unheeding of their winged attacker. When it swooped by again, narrowly missing the Minotauress, an outraged war cry sounded behind the ruined urn where Jurgen landed. The troll sprang from the debris, sword in hand, looking every inch the knight in shining armour. He ran out to meet the giant bird, swinging wildly as it drew near. It was a miss, but the bird's talons struggled to find purchase on his plate armour. It was the start of an epic battle the troll was doomed to lose, and Gretchen racked her brain for a brimstone solution. A burp had disrupted Locathil's conjured battleground. A fart had almost fizzled it completely. Gretchen closed her eyes to clear her mind, and reckoned with what she had on hand to bring about an intestinal explosion capable of inflicting serious damage. Jurgen let out a pained cry, and Gretchen couldn't help her squeal or disrupted concentration. Even from that distance, she saw blood seep from under his shoulder plate and his face strained with pain. Beyond him, Aguilada thumped at the wall with her mace to no avail. Itch powder, and maybe the rest of the stomach ulcer potion. The effervescence of the power teamed with the gaseous brew was her best shot. She fumbled in her pouch for the right jars and ducked out of view to get to work. In horrid, pasty glugs, she swallowed powder and potion in alternate doses, and when the mixture hit her stomach, it gurgled worse than the most caustic brews she'd ever assembled. Her stomach felt like it was on fire, and she crawled from cover to where Jurgen was barely holding off his enemy, now joined by Aguilada taking swipes with her mace from behind. The timepiece Locathil had given Gretchen swung around her neck, and she pulled it free with a grimace. It was the closest thing she had to a line of communication with the elf, and she intended to use the contraption to aim as close as she could to his power. Her stomach rumbled, and as the bird swooped again, she clutched her stomach and let go. The burp that tore up through her throat made the very walls rumble, and Locathil's glamour melted like wax. The crystal fortress appeared stark and jagged, the only smooth plain the towering obelisk behind the Minotauress. "Ah!" Gretchen rolled onto her back, and her eyes boggled at the sight of Locathil swooping down on an intricate set of ropes and pulleys. He wore a twin set of wicked gloves spiked with blades, and his eyes shone with hatred. He collided with Jurgen, knocking the troll to the ground, before gaining purchase on a carved platform on the wall. "Jurgi!" Aguilada screamed, though her feet seemed frozen in place. Her face was a mask of horror, and she turned to the obelisk behind her and cast aside her mace. Gretchen slithered toward her friend, attempting to shield him from the next attack, but when Aguilada reached out to the crystal, the entire chamber became washed in light. A screeching came from above, but Jurgen lifted his head toward his lady love. "I love you, Jurgi." Tears stained Aguilada's bovine face. "I hope you'll always know that." Where the Minotauress stood, light erupted in a fiery glow. Her figure flared into orange embers, and the obelisk thrummed with magical energy. Chapter 8. The ground tremors became violent as ash dissipated around the glowing crystal, and the sounds of shattering drowned out Jurgen's cries. Gretchen looked up toward the vaulted ceiling, hoping her end wouldn't be met under the crushing weight of thousands of pounds of crystal. But as the citadel crumbled, a lustrous cloud of particles swirled in the air above them. "Stay down!" Gretchen tugged at Jürgen's trousers and scrambled beside him. Unpinning her cloak, she threw it over their heads and ignored the sounds of destruction around them. Her stomach burned and itched while her mouth was fouled with the taste of rotten eggs. But she knew if they were going to make it out of the fortress alive, they would need to breathe. Her newly reorganized inventory was fresh in her mind, and she reached in her pouch for the underwater breathing charms. After sticking one vial in her mouth, she pried Jürgen's hands from his face to plug his mouth with another. The air was sweet in her lungs, and for a moment she almost forgot about her dire intestinal complaints. Gretchen was glad Jürgen was being compliant for now, and they rode out the waves of the earthquake together under her cloak. When the rumbles settled down, and the only sound left was an acute ringing in her ears, Gretchen risked a glance from under their makeshift shelter. The earthquake had levelled the island. Stark rock jutted from the sea, the only sign of the labyrinth and its citadel a dark, menacing cloud above them. Locothill lay huddled in a tangle of rope with his hands over his head a little ways from them. But Gretchen's attention was on the two figures in the distance making their way toward them. Wincing as she stood, Gretchen tugged the dust-caked cloak free from Jürgen to check for injuries. A few gashes, thankfully superficial, were visible, but her friend looked to be in one piece. His eyes glistened, and he heaved breaths on the vial like he was hyperventilating. Complete shock, Gretchen mused, and no wonder given what he'd witnessed. She turned back to the approaching figures and held up a hand to shield her eyes from the sun's glare. It was the two pointed hats that tipped her off, and she gasped at the sight of her sister marching along with Nora. She couldn't tell at that distance if Cordelia looked angry or distraught, but she was surprised at the warm, fuzzy feeling her presence brought. The feeling was overcome by lancing pain in her stomach, and her knees gave way. She dropped to the unforgiving rock under her feet and curled into a ball as sweat beaded on her brow. "Gretchen!" It was Cordelia's voice, and the sound of her boots crunching across rocks hastened. A comforting hand landed on Gretchen's shoulder, and she moaned pathetically. "I think I've really done it this time, sis. I'm poisoned. Death by pickled eggs. We need to get her home." Nora's voice was brisk. "Heavens knows what she's done to herself." "That creature!" Cordelia gave Gretchen's shoulder a gentle shake. "Is that the dark elf who held you captive?" Gretchen cracked open an eye and glared at Locothill, cowering in his tangle of ropes between two jutting rocks. He had nowhere left to run, and it looked like the sulphur was still hampering his magic. "I'd tell you to apprehend him, but it would serve the wretch right to be left stranded here." Gretchen rubbed her stomach in slow circles and sat up. Cordelia didn't listen and left her side with fists clenched. Gretchen took the opportunity to check on Jürgen, who already had Nora crouched over him with a worried frown. "The, lady?" Nora pressed her lips into a thin line. "Gone," Gretchen confirmed. "Made the ultimate sacrifice." The vial dropped from the troll's mouth as his face twisted in grief. Gretchen patted his shoulder, then stowed the breathing charm away. She knew. He drew a ragged breath. But she did it anyway. Nora looked up and Gretchen followed her gaze to Cordelia, who prodded Locothill toward them. His hands glimmered with magical binds, and his ankles wore similar hobbles to prevent grandiose plans of escape. Cordelia's face was a mask of cold fury, and she grabbed Locothill's tattered shirt and held out an already glowing blue portal stone. "Quickly!" She curled her lip as she yanked Locothill closer and leaned down so Nora could clasp her arm. Gretchen only had a moment to think about travel sickness, as Nora looped an arm through hers and bunched a fist in a tuft of Jürgen's hair. Then the world began turning, and Gretchen's stomach started doing backflips. They landed in a tangle on silk pillows, and Gretchen curled into the fetal position, clutching her belly. The bright clash of colours didn't look like the academy, though, and she blinked as she tried to reckon with their surroundings. "Where are we?" Gretchen swallowed bile. "Hush!" Cordelia stood and straightened her dress. "Grand sorceress, we bring you the culprit." "In my very own apartments." The voice sounded aloof, and Gretchen rolled to see an aged woman with an assortment of gold hoops piercing her ears and nose. Magical energy seemed to seep from the woman's pores, and after being cut off from her powers for so long, Gretchen felt like she was standing next to the sun. "You are fortunate I had the wards lifted that protect against such intrusion." The smile Cordelia gave was painfully polite, and she nudged Locatil with the toe of her boot. "You asked for discretion and jurisdiction." Gretchen pushed herself up to sit and bumped into Jürgen hunched over behind her. "Does anyone plan on telling me what's going on here?" "Your sister, I presume." Light caught on the glimmering piercings as the witch leaned forward on her perch of cushions. "Tell me, what befell the labyrinth?" Gretchen looked to Cordelia, who nodded, then cleared her throat. "Jurisdiction. They must be on the southern continent. The entire witch community, indeed." "Gone!" Gretchen winced at the flare in the witch's eye. "The Minotauress brought it down. She's gone too." Silence hung thick in the air, and the Grand Sorceress waved to a pair of burly men Gretchen hadn't noticed by the door. They dragged the kicking Locatil forward, and Nora shuffled to Gretchen with bent spectacles and put a hand on her shoulder. "What the heck is going on?" Gretchen hissed. "Diplomatic mayhem," Nora whispered. "You seem to be picking up a talent for it. Once the witches of these lands knew where you were, it was a hissing contest. It took everything your sister had to convince them to leave you and Jürgen out of it." Gretchen blinked at that and watched Cordelia, who held her chin high and back straight. Perhaps she'd had the wrong end of the stick about their relationship. "You stand accused of murdering a demigod, dark elf. You will be tried publicly and your punishment carried out among those who loved her." The Grand Sorceress glowered at Locatil. Gretchen gasped and recoiled against Jürgen's rigid body. "Demigod?" The Grand Sorceress waved the guards away, and Locatil hung limp between them, mewling. It was only after the garishly painted doors closed behind them that the witch looked to Gretchen. "Aguilada is worshipped by some, loathed by others. Such is the way of our people. But she stood as the guardian of the labyrinth for as long as our records date back. It is as close to divine as we will touch on this plane, and her end is a grievous crime." The words were like daggers, and Gretchen turned to wrap an arm around Jürgen's shoulder. He sobbed openly, and Gretchen blinked back tears. "It was love," she said. "She gave herself willingly to—" "Time to go." Cordelia's voice was strangely high-pitched as she turned the portal stone in her palm and spun to hold out her hand. Nora spared Gretchen a warning look and reached to grab Cordelia's wrist while clamping a hand on Gretchen's leg. The world turned into a blur, and when they landed again, it was on the timber floors of the Salton Bog. The smell of stale grog was too much, and Gretchen got onto her hands and knees while retching up a foaming mess of eggy stench. "The sulphur, I presume?" Nora stood with her sleeve over her nose. Gretchen's throat burned, and all she could manage was a stiff nod. Jürgen lurched up from the floor, and the three witches watched in silence as he stormed through the back and slammed the door behind him. A heart-wrenching howl sounded, and Gretchen made to go after him. "Stay there," Nora sighed. "I'll brew us all a pot of tea and go check on him." "He's injured." Gretchen scooted back from the reeking mess on the floor. "Not that he'll admit it." Nora nodded and left the sisters together. Gretchen braced herself for a lecture, but when she met Cordelia's gaze, she only saw a tired woman sitting on a stool with her head propped in one hand. "We spent the better part of a day circling that place with the best dispel charms at the Academy's disposal." She wrinkled her nose at the vomit. "And it seems the contents of your stomach saved the day." Gretchen barked a bitter laugh, then winced as her stomach gurgled. "Not exactly. It just gave Aguilada the chance to fall on her sword." The gravity of the situation settled like a stone on her shoulders. "I'll bet Jürgen will never forgive me. He would have gladly surrendered himself for her." Cordelia frowned and shook her head. It served a larger purpose. Those dolts on the southern continent had no inkling of what was happening on the island. Perhaps. Gretchen knew her sister well enough to understand pragmatism, and a greater purpose were her calling. Love was a silly notion for someone with as much ambition as her. "I'm just glad you made it out safely." A small smile curved her lips. "Foolhardy as it was to set foot there to begin with." Gretchen smiled and felt the bad blood between them wash away. "Thanks for coming to get me." Cordelia sighed and shrugged. I know you don't think much of me, Gretchen, but we're family, and family always has each other's back, even if it will have me mired in paperwork for weeks. Gretchen snorted. Trust her sister to think of the paperwork. Nora nodded at the shape stumbling toward the Salton Bog through the darkened window and stood. Another one. An ogre, by the looks. Gretchen smirked as her friend crept toward the door and whispered at the iron handle. It was a shame they couldn't make the charm permanent, in Gretchen's opinion. But Nora has insisted it was too risky. An outraged cry sounded along with an electric sizzle, and Gretchen doubled over in her chair to keep from laughing out loud. Nora shuffled back to her seat with a wicked glint in her eye, and the would-be patron thumped on the door with a curse before trudging off. It had been much the same all week, and the barflies still weren't getting the idea. How much longer, do you think? Gretchen rubbed her itching stomach and took a healthy draught of ale. Your condition? Nora raised her eyebrows. Or Jürgen? The troll had been a wreck since they'd arrived home and barely left his room. It was Nora who decided to keep the tavern closed to spare him the sounds of people making merry while he drowned in grief. Her stomach, though, was another matter entirely. I'm about ready to swallow my own back-scratcher. That itch powder must rate as the most potent I've ever made. But this can't go on much longer. Can't we just brew some happy potion for him and have done with it? Gretchen, Nora admonished, have a heart. He fell in love with an immortal who gave her life for him. It's more than a regular breakup. Besides, I wouldn't wish that kind of addiction on anyone. Gretchen sighed. Nora was right. Let's at least brainstorm who we can set him up with. The guy was looking for love. Surely there's an ogre, or maybe a dwarf, or... Hey, what about Nellie? A brownie might be a little out of his league, but having her back here would be perfect. We'll do no such thing. You know what it's like to lose someone. Let him come to terms with it in his own way. Nora turned her mug in her hand and pursed her lips. But if I can't shut you up, you can at least tell me what really happened in the maze. Gretchen clicked her teeth shut and swallowed. She knew her friend hadn't bought the story she'd spun for Cordelia, and she'd been thinking for days on how to explain the secret she'd kept from her for so long. But Nora had come through for her more times than she could count. She owed her honesty. It's a long story, one that started back when the mayor came around and asked me to get rid of a troll living under a bridge by some farms. Gretchen explained her accidental enchantment of the troll in minute detail, recounting the spellbook's potions, and how Jürgen had seen right through a camouflage charm. The guilt she'd felt when he turned up in town looking like a tramp, and her need to see him installed somewhere almost killing him when he'd had an allergic reaction at the silversmith's. She rambled on right up to the part where she'd had to explain to Jürgen that he was vulnerable to the labyrinth's strange curse, and stopped to catch her breath. It felt good to get it all off her chest, but when she squinted at Nora in the shadows, Gretchen could see her smirking. What? Gretchen frowned. Aren't you mad at me? I know all that, you nitwit. Oh. Gretchen's face fell, and she swallowed. I remember quite clearly. One day you come around looking for a charm to subdue a troll. The next you introduce your troll friend as the new caretaker around here. I went to the library to see if there were any other enchanted trolls mentioned in the archives. Zilch. Doesn't help that Jürgen doesn't even have a backstory. You two should probably figure something out. I thought for sure the Academy would look into him after the fiasco in Exeter. In retrospect, Gretchen felt awful for having underestimated her friend's intelligence. So, I guess that means you aren't going to turn me in. It isn't illegal to enchant, Gretchen, just supposedly impossible. Most witches believe the old stories are just tall tales. If you went around saying you enchanted a creature, they would most assuredly think it was a tall tale. Gretchen puffed out her cheeks, reassured by the words, even if the implications were more than a little insulting. I didn't really think that I would betray your trust. Perhaps. But if it makes you feel any better, I would have done the same. Really? Gretchen waggled her eyebrows. So, what are you holding back then? Got the Baron under your thrall? Are you really the Baroness who partakes in glamour? Ooh, maybe you head the Witches' Council under an assumed identity. Nora gave her a long-suffering look and shook her head. Oh, Gretchen, if only you knew. Thank you for joining me on this magical journey through The Troll and the Minotauress, Episode 7 of the Gretchen's Misadventures series. If you've enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more enchanting readings and fantastical tales. Share your thoughts on this epic misadventure or recommend your favourite fantasy reads in the comments below. Your insights are the magic that keeps this community thriving. If you're ready for more of Gretchen and her mystical escapades, give this video a thumbs up and hit the notification bell to stay updated on all things magical right here. Until our next adventure, may your books be filled with wonder and your days with magic. Happy reading!